Right, so get this. Imagine a world where, like, your contact lenses, your pacemaker, even your toothbrush are all tracked and regulated across Europe.
It's ambitious to say the least.
Sounds pretty futuristic, right?
The EU is aiming for a level of oversight we really haven't seen before when it comes to products that impact our health and safety.
We're talking about everything from, like, those tiny little contact lenses to, like, those electric toothbrushes that promise whiter teeth and healthier gums.
Yeah,
It's they all fall under this massive regulations.
they do.
So, we are diving deep into the official MDR document itself.
Okay.
It's Silex 32017R0745FRTXT.pdf. It lays out all the rules and requirements, and it's made me look at some everyday items in a totally different light.
One of the most fascinating things I think about the MDR is just its sheer scope.
Yeah.
It's not just focused on complex medical devices you might expect, like pacemakers or surgical instruments. It casts a much wider net, including things you wouldn't normally think of as medical devices at all.
Seriously, my toothbrush, a medical device? It feels a little strange, doesn't it?
It does, but it underscores the EU's commitment to protecting its citizens.
Yeah.
The document emphasizes that a product's intended use, as stated by the manufacturer, is key. So if your toothbrush is marketed as having therapeutic benefits for your gums, for example, it could very well fall under the MDR.
So it's not just about what the product is, but what the company claims it does.
Absolutely.
That's a pretty important distinction.
And this focus on the manufacturer's claims leads us to another interesting area the MDR addresses: nanomaterials.
Okay.
These are tiny particles that are used in a variety of products, including some medical devices.
Okay, nanomaterials now. That sounds a bit more like high-tech medical stuff.
Right.
What's the deal with those? Is it something to be worried about?
Well, there's still a lot we're learning about nanomaterials because of their size and unique properties. There are uncertainties about their potential risks and benefits.
Mm-hmm.
The MDR acknowledges this and takes a cautious approach. For example, manufacturers using nanomaterials that could be absorbed into the body are subject to stricter regulations and testing.
Okay.
It's all about being extra careful when it comes to emerging technologies and potential health impacts.
So the EU is essentially playing it safe with these nanomaterials, making sure they really understand how they work before letting companies use them widely in medical devices.
Exactly. And this cautious, proactive approach extends to how the MDR handles information about medical devices.
Okay.
It establishes something called UDEMD,
Okay.
a comprehensive electronic database that's essentially like a digital watchdog for medical devices in the EU.
UDEMD, huh? What kind of information does it keep track of?
Think of UDEMD as a central hub for everything related to medical devices under the MDR.
Mm-hmm.
It covers device registration, clinical investigations, vigilance reporting, market surveillance, the whole 9 yards.
Wow.
It's designed to increase transparency and ensure that everyone involved, manufacturers, regulators, healthcare professionals, even patients, can access reliable information about medical devices.
So if I wanted to find out more about, say, a specific type of implant, I could potentially look it up in UDEMD and see its safety record, clinical data, and things like that.
That's the idea.
Wow.
It's all about making information more readily available and empowering patients to make informed decisions about their healthcare.
Okay, so we've got this huge database tracking everything, but who's actually making sure all these devices meet the MDR's strict requirements?
That's where the notified bodies come in.
Okay.
They're independent organizations
Uh-huh.
that are responsible for assessing whether a medical device complies with the MDR before it can be sold in the EU.
Okay.
Think of them as the quality control experts.
So they're the ones who actually go through all the data, the clinical trials, and everything else to make sure the device is safe and effective.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the MDR introduces stricter requirements for these notified bodies,
Okay.
making sure they have the necessary expertise and are completely independent from the manufacturers they're auditing.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about increasing the rigor of the conformity assessment process.
So it's like having a much tougher inspector scrutinizing everything before a medical device gets approved.
Absolutely.
That definitely adds an extra layer of reassurance.
And the emphasis on patient safety doesn't stop there.
Okay.
The MDR also places significant emphasis on patient information and empowerment.
That sounds promising. What did that look like in practice?
For example, patients who receive implantable devices will now receive detailed information about those devices,
Okay.
including potential risks and precautions.
Okay.
The idea is to ensure patients are well informed and can participate in decisions about their healthcare.
So no more being in the dark about what's being put into your body.
Right.
You'll actually understand the device, its potential downsides and everything.
Exactly. The MDR also strengthens the requirements for clinical investigations, the studies conducted to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of medical devices.
I imagine those are incredibly important, especially for new devices coming onto the market. What's changed there?
The MDR aligns clinical investigation requirements with internationally recognized guidelines. making it easier for EU research to be accepted globally.
So researchers in Europe and elsewhere can collaborate more easily,
Right.
and patients potentially benefit from access to more cutting-edge treatments.
Precisely. And it's not just about aligning with global standards. The MDR also prioritizes ethical considerations in these clinical investigations. For instance, there's a strong emphasis on informed consent, ensuring that participants fully understand the risks and benefits of being involved in a study.
And what about those vulnerable populations we were talking about earlier, like children or pregnant women? Are there any additional protections for them?
Absolutely. The MDR recognizes the unique ethical considerations involved in research with these groups and includes specific safeguards to ensure their safety and well-being are prioritized.
It's good to know that the EU is taking these ethical considerations seriously.
Yeah.
It's not just about pushing forward with research at any cost, but what happens after a device is approved and out on the market? Does the MDR just wash its hands of it?
Not all. The MDR emphasizes the importance of ongoing post-market surveillance. It requires manufacturers to continuously monitor their devices for safety and performance even after they've been approved.
So it's not just a one-time check.
Yeah.
They're constantly looking for any problems that might pop up once the device is being used in the real world.
Exactly. Manufacturers have to be proactive looking for potential issues,
Okay.
analyzing trends and reporting anything that could impact patient safety. It's about catching problems early and minimizing risks to patients.
Now, I know the MDR represents a major overhaul of medical device regulations in the EU. It must have taken quite a while to put all of this into place, right?
It did. The MDR was actually published back in 2017, but it didn't immediately replace the previous directives.
Okay.
The EU recognized that such sweeping changes take time, so they built in a transition period.
So there was time for manufacturers to adapt to the new requirements
Right.
and for everyone to get up to speed.
Exactly. The MDR doesn't fully replace the previous directives until 2025, which gave everyone several years to adjust and implement the new system.
That makes sense. You can't just flip a switch and expect everyone to be on board with such significant changes overnight.
Precisely, the transition period allowed for a more gradual and hopefully smoother implementation, minimizing disruption for both the industry and, most importantly, patients.
Now, one of the key goals of the MBR is to harmonize regulations across all EU member states, right?
Absolutely. The MBR creates a single set of rules for medical devices across the entire EU, which has some major benefits for manufacturers and patients alike.
I can imagine that makes it much easier for companies to sell their devices across different countries without having to navigate a bunch of different regulations.
Exactly. It streamlines the process and fosters innovation by creating a level playing field. It also ensures that patients across the EU benefit from the same high standards of safety and quality regardless of where they live.
It's like having one set of rules for the road so everyone knows what to expect and can drive safely across borders.
That's a great analogy. The MDR also introduces the concept of a person responsible for regulatory compliance within manufacturing companies.
So it's not just a vague company-wide responsibility. There's an individual who's specifically accountable for making sure everything is up to code.
Exactly. This person needs to have a deep understanding of the MDR's requirements and the expertise to ensure the company meets all its obligations. It's a crucial role, especially given the complexity of the MDR.
Now, that sounds like a pretty demanding job. I imagine smaller companies might be struggling to find someone with the necessary experience, especially given how new these regulations are.
That's a valid concern, and the MDR actually addresses this.
Okay.
Micro and small enterprises, as defined by EU recommendations, aren't required to have a full-time, dedicated regulatory compliance person on staff.
So there's some flexibility for smaller companies who might not have the resources to hire a full-time expert?
Absolutely. However, they still need to ensure access to someone with the necessary expertise, even if it's on a consultancy basis. The bottom line is that regulatory compliance is non-negotiable, regardless of a company's size.
Makes sense. You can't just get a free pass because you're a small operation. Patient safety is still the priority.
Precisely, and this focus on patient safety extends to how the MDR handles any modifications made to medical devices after they've been approved.
I could see why that would be important. Even seemingly small changes could have unintended consequences if they're not carefully considered.
Exactly. Any modifications to a device's design or characteristics need to go through a specific process to ensure they don't impact the device's safety or performance.
So companies can't just tweak their products without going through a proper review process.
That's right. The MDR outlines very clear procedures for managing these changes, ensuring that any modifications are carefully evaluated and don't compromise the device's compliance with the regulation.
It's like having a system of checks and balances in place to prevent companies from making changes that could put patients at risk. Now, I know there's been some debate about reprocessing single-use devices. Does the MDR address that practice at all?
It certainly does. The MDR allows for the reprocessing of single-use devices under very specific conditions.
Okay.
For instance, it must be permitted by the national law of the EU member state where the reprocessing takes place.
So it's not a blanket EU-wide permission. Each country gets to decide if and how they'll allow this practice.
Exactly. And even if reprocessing is permitted, there are strict requirements.
Okay.
The MDR considers anyone who reprocesses a single-use device to be the manufacturer of that reprocessed device.
That makes sense. If you're essentially creating a new device from a used one, you should be held to the same standard as any other manufacturer.
Precisely, the reprocessor becomes fully responsible for meeting all the requirements of the MDR, just like the original manufacturer.
Wow.
And there are additional obligations for them as well to ensure traceability and accountability.
Now let's talk about systems or procedure packs, those pre-assembled sets of medical devices or products that are often used for specific procedures.
Right.
I'm thinking of things like surgical kits or trays of instruments. Does the MDR address those as well?
It certainly does. The MDR recognizes that someone needs to take responsibility for ensuring that the entire system or pack as a whole meets the safety and performance requirements.
So the person or company who puts these packs together can't just assume that everything's fine because the individual components were already approved.
That's right. They have specific obligations under the MDR.
Okay.
They need to apply certain conformity assessment procedure to verify that the assembled system is safe and effective for its intended use.
That makes sense. You wouldn't want a situation where a surgical kit, for example, is put together in a way that creates a new hazard just because of how the components are arranged or combined.
Exactly. And the MDR also emphasizes the importance of clear labeling and information for these systems and packs.
So it should be clear who assembled the pack and what information is relevant for each of the individual components.
Precisely, this allows healthcare professionals to easily identify the source of the assembled system and access all the necessary information about the devices within it. Transparency and traceability are key.
Now let's talk about one of the most interesting and potentially game-changing aspects of the MDR. The introduction of the Unique Device Identification System, or UDI. This is all about giving each individual medical device a digital fingerprint, right?
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
The UDI is a unique code that allows for the identification and tracking of a specific medical device throughout its entire life cycle.
Mm-hmm.
It's like having a passport for each device containing important information about its origin, manufacturing details, and more.
I could see how that would be incredibly helpful, especially when it comes to things like tracking devices in case of a recall or monitoring for potential safety issues.
Exactly. The UDI is a key component of the MDR's efforts to enhance patient safety, improve market surveillance, and combat counterfeiting.
Mm-hmm.
It's a complex system, but it has the potential to revolutionize how medical devices are managed and monitored.
So this UDI is more than just a serial number.
Right.
It's a comprehensive identifier that provides a wealth of information about each individual device.
Exactly. And the MDR outlines a detailed framework for implementing the UDI system,
Okay.
covering everything from how the codes are assigned to how the information is managed and shared within the UDF database.
That makes sense. You need a well-structured system to ensure the UDI is actually effective and everyone's using it correctly.
Absolutely. The UDI is a foundational element of the MDR, and it's a game changer for medical device regulation in the EU.
Okay.
It's a complex topic, but we'll definitely delve into more details about it later on.
I'm looking forward to learning more about it. Now, we've mentioned UDAME several times already, and it sounds like it plays a pretty central role in all of this. Can you tell us a bit more about what makes this database so important?
UDEEMD is essentially the backbone of the MDR.
Okay.
It's a massive centralized database that houses a vast amount of information about medical devices available in the EU.
Mm-hmm.
The MDR outlines specific functionalities for UDEEMD, and its scope is truly impressive.
So it's more than just a simple registry of medical devices.
Much more. It's a multifaceted system that supports all aspects of the MDR, as we discussed. It contains the UDI database, allowing for the identification and tracking of individual devices. It also serves as a platform for manufacturers to register themselves and their devices, providing a centralized source of information about who's making what and where it's being sold.
It sounds like Unimart is bringing much-needed transparency to the medical device landscape.
Exactly, but it doesn't stop there. Udemot also plays a crucial role in managing vigilance and post-market surveillance data.
Okay.
Manufacturers are required to report any adverse events or safety concerns related to their devices to Udemot,
Mm-hmm.
which allows authorities to monitor device safety in real time and intervene quickly if necessary.
So it's a proactive system for identifying potential problems and protecting patients.
Exactly. UDOMD also supports the work of notified bodies, giving them access to relevant information about devices and manufacturers to help them carry out their conformity assessment procedures. It's all about fostering collaboration and information sharing to improve the overall safety and effectiveness of medical devices.
That's fantastic. It sounds like UDOMD is truly revolutionizing how medical devices are regulated in the EU.
It certainly
Yeah.
is. The MDR sets clear deadlines for the full implementation of UDOMD, recognizing that it's a complex project that requires a phased approach.
Hmm.
The ultimate goal is to have a fully functional and interoperable system that supports all aspects of the MDR, from device registration to post-market surveillance. UDOMD will be an invaluable resource for everyone involved in the medical device landscape, including patients.
Speaking of those responsible for assessing medical devices, let's shift our attention back to the notified bodies. We touched upon them earlier, but it seems like the MDR places a lot of emphasis on their role and how they operate. Why is that?
You're right, the MDR raises the bar significantly for notified bodies, the independent organizations responsible for assessing the conformity of medical devices before they can be placed on the EU market. This is a critical step in ensuring patient safety.
I imagine the MDR introduces a lot of new requirements for these notified bodies to meet. What are some of the key changes?
Well, for starters, the MDR introduces much stricter requirements for notified bodies, aiming to ensure they're up to the task of evaluating devices against the more stringent standards.
Okay.
These requirements cover a wide range of areas,
Okay.
including the notified body's organizational structure, competence and expertise, impartiality, and transparency.
So it's not just about checking boxes, it's about ensuring that these organizations are truly qualified and operate with the highest levels of integrity.
Exactly. One of the most important aspects highlighted in the MDR is the need for notified bodies to be completely independent from the manufacturers they are assessing.
Hmm.
There can't be any conflicts of interest that could potentially bias their judgment.
That makes sense. You wouldn't want a notified body giving a free pass to a device just because they have some financial ties to the company making it.
Absolutely. The MDR addresses this head-on by setting very strict rules regarding conflicts of interest.
Okay.
Notified body personnel can't have any financial or personal ties to manufacturers that could influence their decisions.
Hmm.
There are also limitations on the services that notified bodies can offer to manufacturers to prevent situations where they might be auditing their own work.
It's all about establishing a system where the assessments are truly objective and based solely on the evidence and the requirements of the MDR. But being independent isn't enough, right? They also need to have the necessary expertise to evaluate these devices.
You're absolutely right. Competence is another critical area that the MDR addresses.
Okay.
Notified bodies need to demonstrate that they have a deep understanding of the specific types of medical devices they are assessing.
So if a notified body is evaluating a complex heart implant, for example, they need to have experts on staff who really understand how these devices work, what the potential risks are, and what the latest scientific research says about their safety and effectiveness.
Exactly. They need qualified personnel with the right technical knowledge, clinical expertise, and regulatory experience to evaluate a device's design, its manufacturing processes, and its clinical evidence. It's a tall order, and the MDR makes sure notified bodies are up to the task.
So how does the MDR ensure that these notified bodies meet these high standards? It can't just be a matter of them saying, trust us, we're qualified.
You're right, the MDR introduces much stricter rules for how notified bodies are designated and overseen.
Okay.
It's no longer just a matter of self-declaration.
So there's a more rigorous vetting process now.
Exactly. EU member states are still responsible for designating notified bodies within their territory.
Mm-hmm.
But now there's a much greater level of scrutiny from the European Commission.
Okay.
They have a more active role in assessing the competence and performance of notified bodies and can take action if they're not meeting the requirements.
So the European Commission is essentially acting as a watchdog, making sure that the notified bodies across the EU are all operating at the same high level.
Precisely, and to ensure consistency and quality across the EU, the MDR also introduces a system of joint assessments.
What are those?
It's basically a peer review process.
Okay.
Experts from different member states come together to evaluate a notified body, making sure they're applying the MDR requirements consistently and thoroughly.
It's like having a second set of eyes, or in this case, several sets of eyes to make sure everything is being done properly. It's reassuring to know that there are these checks and balances in place.
Absolutely. And to further promote accountability, the MDR also emphasizes transparency in the work of notified bodies.
What does that mean in practice? Are they required to publish reports or something?
They are.
Okay.
Notified bodies now have to publish information about their activities,
Okay.
including the types of devices they assess, the fees they charge, and data on their performance. This allows manufacturers and the public to better understand the role of the notified bodies and to hold them accountable for their decisions.
It's all about creating a more open and transparent system.
Exactly, and to really ensure that manufacturers are staying on top of their game, the MDR introduces the requirement for unannounced audits.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. So no more scheduling a visit weeks in advance and giving manufacturers time to make sure everything looks perfect?
Exactly. Notified bodies can now show up at a manufacturer's facility unannounced to conduct an audit.
Wow.
This helps to ensure that manufacturers are consistently meeting the requirements of the MDR even when they're not expecting an inspection. It's all about promoting a culture of ongoing compliance, not just ticking boxes when an audit is scheduled.
That's a smart approach. It keeps manufacturers on their toes and makes it much more likely that they're truly adhering to the regulations at all times, not just when they know someone is coming to check.
Precisely. The MDR also gives notified bodies more authority to request samples of devices or to conduct physical or laboratory tests to verify compliance. This provides them with the tools they need to thoroughly assess whether a device truly meets the requirements of the MDR.
These stricter requirements for notified bodies are a crucial element of the MDR's overall goal of enhancing patient safety by strengthening their role and confidence. The MDR aims to ensure that only safe, effective, and compliant devices reach the market.
Now let's talk about something that plays a significant role in international trade of medical devices: free sale certificates.
That sounds intriguing. What are those and why are they important in the context of the MDR?
A free sale certificate is a document that confirms a medical device can legally be marketed and sold in a particular country or region.
Okay.
It basically serves as evidence that the device has met that area's regulatory requirements. Think of it like a stamp of approval from a regulatory authority.
So when a medical device is being imported into the EU, a free sale certificate from its country of origin can be helpful in showing that the device meets certain basic safety and quality standards.
Exactly. It can streamline the import process and provide reassurance to EU authorities that the device has undergone some level of regulatory scrutiny.
But I imagine there's no universal format for these certificates, right? Different countries might have their own ways of doing things.
You're absolutely right. The MDR recognizes that different countries might have their own systems in place,
Yeah.
so it doesn't mandate a specific format for these free sale certificates.
Okay.
However, it does give the European Commission the power to create a model format taking international practices into account.
So there's flexibility in the short term, but there's also the possibility for greater standardization in the future.
Exactly. The goal is to ensure a certain level of consistency and to make it easier for EU authorities to recognize and accept these certificates from other countries.
Okay.
This helps facilitate trade and ensures that devices entering the EU market have met at least a baseline level of regulatory scrutiny.
That makes sense. It's about striking a balance between respecting different regulatory approaches and making sure that all devices entering the EU market meet some basic safety and quality standards.
Now, shifting gears a bit, let's dive into a crucial aspect of patient safety: vigilance. The MDR places significant emphasis on monitoring the performance and safety of medical devices once they're already on the market and being used by patients.
That seems essential. After all, the real test of a device's safety happens in the real world when it's being used by real people, right?
Precisely, vigilance in the context of medical devices is all about systematically collecting, assessing, and taking action on information related to any incidents or adverse events that occur with a device. It's about being proactive, not just waiting for problems to arise and then reacting.
So what are the key elements of this vigilance system that the MDR sets up?
Well, it establishes a clear framework for vigilance,
Okay.
outlining the roles and responsibilities of various actors, including manufacturers, healthcare professionals, and competent authorities.
Mhm.
Everyone has a part to play in ensuring that devices are being used safely and that any problems are identified and addressed promptly.
So if I'm a doctor and I notice a problem with a device I'm using, I have a responsibility to report that.
Absolutely. Healthcare professionals are often on the front lines and might be the first to notice a problem with the device.
Okay.
The MDR encourages them to report any suspected incidents or adverse events either to the manufacturer directly or to the competent authorities.
And what about patients themselves? Do they have a role to play in this vigilance system?
They absolutely do. Patients can provide valuable insights into their experiences with the device and any unexpected effects they might have experienced.
Mm-hmm.
The MDR encourages patients to report any concerns they have either to their healthcare provider or directly to the manufacturer or authorities.
So it's about creating a culture of safety where everyone feels empowered to speak up if they have a concern about a medical device.
Exactly. The more information that's collected and analyzed, the better equipped we are to identify potential problems and keep patients safe.
Now, we've been talking a lot about the responsibilities of manufacturers and others, but what about the role of those competent authorities? What are they doing to ensure device safety?
The competent authorities are the national regulatory bodies responsible for overseeing medical devices in their respective countries.
Okay.
They have a crucial role to play in the MDR's vigilance system.
So they're the ones who receive the reports of incident and adverse events.
Exactly. They assess the reports, conduct further investigations if necessary,
Mm-hmm.
and determine what actions need to be taken to protect public health.
Okay.
They also play a key role in market surveillance.
Market surveillance, what does that involve?
Market surveillance encompasses all the activities that competent authorities undertake to ensure that medical devices available on the market actually comply with the requirements of the MDR and are safe for patients, users, and everyone else. It's about actively monitoring the market, not just reacting to incidents.
So it's a more proactive approach to ensuring device safety.
Exactly. It involves things like checking the documentation and labeling of devices, taking samples and conducting tests, inspecting the premises of manufacturers and distributors, and monitoring the information that's being disseminated about devices.
It sounds like a comprehensive approach to making sure that companies are playing by the rules and that patients are protected.
It is the MDR gives competent authorities a wide range of tools and powers to enforce the regulation,
Mm-hmm.
and they can take action if they find a device that doesn't meet the requirements.
That's reassuring to know, but I imagine it's a massive task to monitor the entire medical device market. How do they prioritize their efforts?
That's where the concept of risk-based market surveillance comes in.
Risk-based market surveillance, what does that mean?
It means that competent authorities prioritize their efforts based on the level of risk associated with a particular device or type of device.
Okay.
So devices that pose a higher risk to patients would receive more scrutiny than lower risk devices. It's a common sense approach to allocating resources effectively.
So a simple bandage wouldn't receive the same level of attention as a heart implant, for example.
Exactly. And the MDR provides guidance to competent authorities on how to conduct these risk assessments, taking into account a variety of factors like the device's intended use, its complexity, the target patient population, the potential for harm, and any history of safety concerns.
It sounds like a very thorough process.
It is. And importantly, the MDR emphasizes the need for collaboration and information sharing between competent authorities in different member states.
That makes sense. A device that's deemed unsafe in one country shouldn't be allowed to be sold freely in another country.
Exactly. The MDR establishes mechanisms for exchanging information about market surveillance activities and coordinating responses to non-compliant or unsafe devices.
So if one country finds a problem, others can quickly take action to protect their own citizens. It's about working together to ensure a consistently high level of safety across the entire EU.
Precisely now, one area that's becoming increasingly important in the world of medical devices is software. We're seeing more and more devices that rely heavily on software or that are essentially software-based medical devices in their own right.
That's true. Think about all the health apps on our phones these days, or the software that controls complex medical equipment in hospitals. Does the MDR address this growing role of software in healthcare?
It certainly does. The MDR recognizes the growing importance of software in medical devices and provides specific guidance on how it should be regulated.
So it's not just tacked on as an afterthought. Software is explicitly addressed in the MDR.
Exactly. The MDR clarifies that software intended to be used for medical purposes is itself considered a medical device.
So if a piece of software is designed to diagnose a condition, monitor a patient's vital signs, or control a life-supporting machine, it falls under the scope of the MDR.
Precisely. And just like with physical medical devices, the MDR uses a risk-based approach to classify software.
So software that poses a higher risk to patients would be subject to stricter regulations and more thorough assessment.
Exactly. The MDR outlines specific conformity assessment procedures for software, and these procedures vary depending on the software's risk classification.
I imagine this is a complex area, especially as technology is constantly evolving and new types of software are being developed all the time.
It is, but the MDR provides a solid framework for regulating software and ensuring that it meets the same high standards of safety and performance as any other medical device.
And what about those updates and modifications that software often goes through? How does the MDR handle those?
That's another area where the MDR provides clear guidance. It requires manufacturers to manage software changes in a way that ensures any updates or modifications are assessed for their potential impact on safety and performance.
Okay.
They have to go through appropriate conformity assessment procedures before they're released. It's about making sure that the software remains safe and effective even as it evolves and changes over time.
Now we're living in an increasingly connected world, and medical devices are no exception. Many devices are now connected to networks or the internet, which raises concerns about cybersecurity. Does the MDR address this at all?
It absolutely does. The MDR recognizes that cybersecurity is a critical consideration for software-based medical devices,
Okay.
and it requires manufacturers to take steps to mitigate these risks.
So what kind of safeguards are we talking about?
The MDR requires manufacturers to consider cybersecurity risks throughout the entire life cycle of the software and to implement appropriate measures to protect against them.
So it's about building security into the software from the ground up, not just adding it as an afterthought.
Exactly. This includes things like protecting the software from unauthorized access, ensuring the confidentiality and integrity of patient data, and having a plan in place to respond to and recover from any cybersecurity incidents.
It sounds like the MDR is taking a very comprehensive approach to regulating software and ensuring that it's safe, effective, and secure.
It is. The MDR represents a major step forward in how medical devices are regulated in the EU, and its provisions on software reflect the evolving landscape of healthcare technology.
Now, all of these changes we've been discussing, the expanded scope of the MDR, the stricter requirements for notified bodies, the emphasis on clinical evidence and post-market surveillance, it represents a major shift in how medical devices are regulated in the EU. It must be presenting quite a few challenges for everyone involved.
It certainly is. One of the biggest challenges is simply the sheer volume of work involved in implementing the MDR.
Yeah.
Manufacturers, notified bodies, competent authorities, they're all facing a huge task in adapting to the new requirements and putting the necessary systems and processes in place.
It's a steep learning curve for everyone involved, and I imagine the timelines for implementation are pretty tight.
They are. The transition period from the old directives to the MDR is limited.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to accomplish in a relatively short amount of time.
Another challenge I could imagine is the increased demand for resources.
Absolutely. Implementing the MDR requires significant investments in terms of personnel expertise and infrastructure.
Yeah.
Notified bodies, for example, need to expand their capacity and expertise to handle the increased workload and the more complex assessments required under the MDR.
And manufacturers need to invest in upgrading their quality management systems, conducting more rigorous clinical investigations, and implementing robust post-market surveillance plans. It's a significant financial burden for many companies, especially smaller ones.
You're right, and the MDR also introduces new complexities in the supply chain with more actors involved and each actor having specific obligations.
So it's not just about a single company complying, it's about ensuring that everyone involved in the life cycle of a medical device, from the manufacturer to the importer to the distributor, is on the same page and meeting their responsibilities.
Exactly. This requires a much greater level of coordination and communication throughout the supply chain, which can be a logistical challenge.
The MDR also raises the bar for clinical evidence,
Yeah.
requiring more rigorous clinical investigations and ongoing post-market clinical follow-up.
The requirements for clinical data are much stricter than under the previous directives. This means manufacturers need to invest more time and resources in gathering and assessing clinical data, which can be a significant undertaking.
And I can imagine there's some uncertainty around how to interpret and implement the MDR's requirements, given how detailed and complex it is.
That's another challenge. There's always room for interpretation when it comes to complex regulations,
Yeah.
which can lead to inconsistencies in how the requirements are applied by different notified bodies and competent authorities.
So there's a risk of things being a bit of a patchwork with different interpretations in different countries or even by different notified bodies within the same country?
That's a possibility, although the MDR does include provisions to try to minimize these inconsistencies and promote a more harmonized approach to implementation.
It sounds like there's a lot of work to be done to ensure everyone is on the same page and applying the MDR consistently.
Absolutely. And let's not forget the challenges associated with implementing the new concepts introduced by the MDR, like the UDI system and UDEMD.
Right.
It's not just about understanding the regulations, it's also about building the technological infrastructure and the processes to support them.
That's a huge undertaking. It's like building a whole new system from the ground up.
It is, but despite all these challenges, the MDR is a positive step forward for medical device regulation in the EU.
Yeah.
It's a complex and demanding regulation, but it's ultimately about improving patient safety and ensuring that medical devices meet the highest standards of quality and performance.
It's about raising the bar for the entire medical device industry, from how devices are designed and tested to how they're monitored once they're on the market. It's about putting patients first.
Exactly. Now, to circle back to clinical investigations for a moment, The MDR lays down specific requirements for how these studies need to be conducted, especially when they're done specifically to show a device meets the regulation standards.
That makes sense. These clinical investigations are the foundation for demonstrating a device's safety and effectiveness. The MDR can't just take a company's word for it. They need to see the data.
Exactly, and these requirements go beyond just making sure the science is sound.
Okay.
They also address ethical considerations and patient safety, aligning with international guidelines like ISO 14155.
So it's not just about getting the data. It's about getting the data ethically and responsibly.
Absolutely. One of the cornerstones of these requirements is informed consent.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone participating in a clinical investigation needs to fully understand the risks and benefits involved and freely agree to participate.
That seems like a fundamental ethical principle. No one should be pressured or coerced into participating in a study, especially when it involves their health.
Exactly, and there's a heightened level of protection when it comes to vulnerable populations like children or pregnant women.
Right.
The MDR recognizes the unique ethical considerations that arise when conducting clinical investigations with these groups and includes additional safeguards to ensure their well-being.
It makes sense. You need to be extra careful when you're dealing with people who might be more susceptible to harm or who might not be able to fully understand the risks and benefits of participating in a study.
Precisely. And to further ensure the integrity of these investigations, the MDR mandates that they are conducted according to a pre-approved clinical investigation plan.
So it's not a free-for-all. There's a structured process in place to make sure the study is designed properly and will actually answer the questions it's supposed to answer.
Exactly. This plan outlines all the key details,
Okay.
the methodology, how participants will be selected, how the data will be analyzed, everything, and it needs to be reviewed and approved by both a competent authority like a national regulatory body and an ethics committee before the investigation can even begin.
It's a system of checks and balances to ensure that the study is scientifically sound, ethically justifiable, and will actually generate reliable data. It's good to know that there's this level of oversight.
Now, for certain high-risk devices, the MDR introduces an interesting concept called a consultation procedure.
A consultation procedure, what's that all about?
Essentially, it allows manufacturers of these high-risk devices to get feedback on their clinical evaluation plan and their proposed clinical investigations from an expert panel.
Okay.
And this happens before they even submit their full clinical evaluation to a notified body for review.
So it's like a pre-submission checkup where they can get expert advice and make sure they're on the right track before they go through the formal assessment process.
That's a great way to put it. It's an opportunity to identify any potential issues early on, get feedback on their methodology, and strengthen the overall quality of their clinical evidence. It can save everyone time and effort in the long run and ultimately leads to safer devices.
It sounds like a valuable step, especially when you're dealing with devices that could have a major impact on people's health if something goes wrong. But even after a device is approved and out on the market, the evaluation doesn't stop, right?
You're absolutely right. The MDR stresses the importance of post-market clinical follow-up. Gathering clinical evidence doesn't stop once a device is available to patients.
Because what happens in the real world might not always reflect what was seen in the controlled environment of a clinical trial.
Exactly. Real-world use often reveals things that might not have been apparent during pre-market testing.
Right.
So manufacturers are required to continue collecting and assessing clinical data even after their device is being used by patients.
So it's like a continuous feedback loop where the data from real-world use is used to confirm the initial findings, identify any new risks that might emerge, and inform potential updates to the device or even to the clinical evaluation itself.
That's a great way to think about it. This post-market surveillance data is invaluable for ensuring that a device remains safe and effective throughout its entire life cycle. And to make sure this post-market follow-up is done systematically, the MDR requires manufacturers to have a specific plan in place.
So it's not just about collecting data haphazardly. There needs to be a clear strategy behind it.
Exactly. This post-market clinical follow-up plan outlines the data sources that will be used, the methods for analyzing the data, and most importantly, the procedures for taking action if any safety red flags are raised. It's a crucial part of the MDR's overall approach to patient safety.
It's reassuring to know that the MDR takes such a comprehensive approach from those initial clinical investigations to the ongoing monitoring once the device is out in the world. It's about making sure that the focus on safety continues throughout a device's entire life cycle.
Absolutely. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's zoom in on some of the specific responsibilities manufacturers have under the MDR. One of the key things they need to do is designate a specific person within their organization who is responsible for regulatory compliance.
So it's not just a general company-wide responsibility. There's an individual who's accountable for making sure the company's meeting all the requirements of the MDR.
Exactly. This person is essentially the point person for everything related to the MDR. They need to have a deep understanding of the regulation and the expertise to ensure the company is dotting its I's and crossing its T's.
I imagine the MDR outlines some specific qualifications for this individual, given the complexity of the regulation.
It certainly does.
Okay.
They need demonstrable experience in areas like regulatory affairs or quality management systems.
Okay.
It underscores just how seriously the MDR takes compliance.
Now, for smaller companies that might not have the resources to have a dedicated full-time regulatory expert on staff, this might seem daunting. Does the MDR offer any flexibility for them?
It does. The MDR recognizes that micro and small enterprises, as defined by the EU's recommendations, might not have the capacity to have a full-time regulatory compliance person in-house.
So there's some understanding of the challenges that smaller companies face.
Absolutely. However, they still need to ensure they have access to someone with the necessary expertise, even if it's through a consultant or an external expert.
Okay.
The bottom line is that regulatory compliance is non-negotiable regardless of the company's size.
Patient safety comes first no matter what.
Exactly. And another area where manufacturers need to be particularly meticulous is when they're making any modifications to their devices. The MDR lays out very specific procedures for handling these changes, and for good reason.
Because even seemingly small changes could have unintended consequences. It's like that saying, for want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. A tiny change could snowball into a big problem.
You're exactly right. Any modification, however minor it might seem, has the potential to affect a device's safety, its performance, and ultimately its compliance with the MDR. Manufacturers can't just tinker with their devices without considering the regulatory implications.
So what kind of changes would trigger this more thorough review process?
Well, one clear-cut example is any change to the intended purpose of the device.
Okay.
If a company was originally marketing a device for one specific use and then decides they want to market it for something else entirely, that's a big deal.
That makes perfect sense. You can just repurpose a device without proving that it's safe and effective for that new use.
Exactly. And even if the intended use stays the same, any change that could affect the device's safety or performance needs to be carefully evaluated.
Okay.
The MDR even provides some specific examples of what it considers significant modifications that would require this closer look.
I'm curious, what are some of those examples?
For instance, let's say a manufacturer decides to switch to a different material for a component in their device that might seem like a small change, but depending on the material and its intended use, it could affect the device's durability, its biocompatibility, or how it interacts with the body. That's something that would need to be carefully evaluated.
It's all about anticipating potential problems and making sure that any changes are made with patient safety in mind.
Precisely, the bottom line is that manufacturers need to be extremely diligent when making any changes to their devices, no matter how small, and ensure they're following the MDR's procedures to the letter.
Now, I know there's been some controversy around the practice of reprocessing single-use devices, essentially taking a device that was intended to be used only once and cleaning and sterilizing it so it can be used again. Does the MDR address this practice at all?
It does. It's a complex issue, and the MDR doesn't completely ban the reprocessing of single-use devices, but it lays down very strict conditions that need to be met.
So it's a highly regulated area, and for good reason. There are definitely concerns about whether these reprocessed devices are truly as safe and effective as new ones.
Absolutely. The MDR takes a cautious approach. First and foremost, reprocessing can only happen if it's specifically allowed by the national law of the EU country where the reprocessing is taking place, so it's not a blanket EU-wide permission.
Each country gets to decide its own stance on this based on its own assessments of the risks and benefits.
Exactly. And even if reprocessing is allowed, there are stringent requirements.
Okay.
The MDR considers anyone who reprocesses a single-use device to be the manufacturer of that reprocessed device.
So they're essentially taking on the responsibility of the original manufacturer.
Exactly. They become fully responsible for meeting all the requirements of the MDR, just as if they had designed and manufactured the device from scratch. And there are additional obligations specifically for reprocessors aimed at ensuring accountability and transparency.
Like what kind of obligations?
One key requirement is having a robust system in place for tracking and tracing those reprocessed devices.
So if there's ever a problem of a reprocessed device, they can quickly figure out where it came from, what its history is, and whether any other devices might be affected.
Exactly. Traceability is crucial in this context. It's about being able to track the device's journey and ensuring accountability.
Now, another area the MDR addresses is the creation of those systems or procedure packs, essentially sets of different medical devices or products that are are packaged together for a specific medical purpose.
You're right, these are common in healthcare settings.
Yeah.
Think about a surgical kit that contains all the instruments a surgeon needs for a particular operation, or a pre-assembled tray of supplies needed for a specific procedure. The MDR recognizes that someone needs to take responsibility for ensuring that the entire system or pack as a whole meets those safety and performance requirements we've been talking about.
So it's not enough to just check that the individual components are compliant. You need to make sure that the way they're put together doesn't create any new hazards or problems.
Precisely, the person or company assembling these systems or packs has specific obligations under the MDR. They need to follow certain procedures to verify that the assembled system is safe and effective for its intended use.
Okay.
This might involve reviewing the documentation for the individual components, conducting tests on the assembled system, or doing a risk assessment to identify any potential hazards that might arise from combining the devices in a particular way.
It makes sense. You wouldn't want a situation where a surgical kit, for example, is put together in a way that makes it more likely for a surgeon to accidentally grab the wrong instrument or for a component to become dislodged during a procedure.
Exactly. And to ensure transparency, the MDR also requires clear labeling and information for these systems and packs.
So anyone using the system should be able to easily identify who assembled it and access all the relevant information about each of the individual components.
Precisely, this includes the name and contact details of the person or company who assembled the system or pack, along with the essential information from the original manufacturers of each device.
This is all about making sure that healthcare professionals have all the information they need to use these systems safely and effectively.
Now let's delve into one of the most innovative and impactful aspects of the MDR. The introduction of the Unique Device Identification System, or UDI.
We touched on this earlier, but I'm eager to learn more. This is all about giving each medical device its own unique digital fingerprint, right?
Exactly. The UDI is a game changer for traceability, safety, and market surveillance. It's all about giving each device a unique code that allows it to be identified and tracked throughout its entire life cycle, from manufacturing to the point of use with a patient.
It's like giving every device its own passport with all its essential details recorded and readily accessible. I can see how that would be immensely helpful in a variety of situations.
Absolutely. For instance, if there's a safety alert or a recall, manufacturers and authorities can use the UDI to quickly identify which devices are affected, where they were distributed, and even potentially which patients received them. It makes the whole process much more efficient and targeted.
It takes the guesswork out of things and allows for a much more precise and rapid response, which is crucial when patient safety is at stake.
Exactly. The UDI also facilitates the reporting and analysis of adverse events. When a healthcare professional or a patient reports a problem with a device, they can use the UDI to provide specific information about that particular device, not just a general description. This allows authorities to spot potential safety trends more easily and take appropriate action faster.
So it's not just about knowing that a device caused a problem, but about knowing exactly which device it was down to the specific unit. That level of granularity is incredibly helpful for investigations and for identifying patterns that might not be obvious from individual reports.
Exactly. This is crucial for effective market surveillance. And on top of all that, the UDI system is a powerful tool in the fight against counterfeit medical devices, which can pose a serious threat to public health. By giving each legitimate device a unique identifier, it becomes much harder for counterfeiters to slip their fake products into the supply chain.
That's a huge win for patient safety. Counterfeit devices can be incredibly dangerous because they might not have gone through any safety testing or quality control. They might be made from substandard materials or might not function as intended, putting patients at risk.
You're right, and unfortunately, counterfeit medical devices are a growing problem in many parts of the world. The UDI system is a crucial step in combating this problem and ensuring that patients receive only safe and authentic devices.
Now, I know the MDR lays out a detailed framework for implementing this UDI system, but it sounds quite complex. Can you break it down for us a bit?
Certainly, the MDI covers everything from how the UDI should be assigned, what information they need to contain, how they should be displayed on the device and its packaging, and how that information is managed within the UDUM database. It's a comprehensive system, leaving little room for ambiguity.
So it's not just a matter of slapping a random code on a device. There's a specific structure and a whole set of rules to follow.
Exactly. The MDI provides clear guidelines to ensure that the UDI system is implemented consistently and effectively across the EU. Now, the UDI itself consists of two parts, the UDI-DI and the UDI-PI. The UDI-DI, which stands for Device Identifier, is a static code specific to a particular model or version of a device. Think of it as the device's unique fingerprint.
So the UDI/DI tells you exactly what the device is, who made it, and what its specific model or version is.
Precisely, it provides essential information about the device itself. Now, the UDI-PI, or production identifier, is a bit different. It provides more granular information about a specific production unit of that device, like the lot or batch number, the manufacturing date, the expiry date, and potentially even the serial number.
So if you have two devices that are the same model but were manufactured on different dates or belong to different batches, they would have the same UDI/DI but different UDI/TIs.
Exactly. The combination of the UDI/DI and the UDI/PI creates a unique identifier for each individual device produced, allowing it to be tracked from the factory floor to the patient.
That's impressive. It's like having a complete history of each device right there in its code.
You got it. And this level of granularity is invaluable for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it improves the traceability of devices. Imagine a situation where there's a safety issue with a particular batch of devices with the UDI system manufacturers, and authorities can quickly identify all the devices from that batch, no matter where they've ended up in the supply chain.
They can issue targeted recalls, locate affected devices, and make sure they're taken out of circulation, minimizing the risk to patients.
Exactly. It also makes it much easier to investigate adverse event reports. Healthcare professionals or patients can provide the UDI of the specific device, involve giving investigators precise information about the device's history and manufacturing details. This can be crucial in determining the root cause of a problem and preventing similar incidents from happening again.
It's about taking the guesswork out of these investigations and making them much more data-driven and precise.
Precisely. And as we mentioned earlier, the UDI system is a powerful tool in combating counterfeit medical devices. By giving each legitimate device its own unique identifier, it becomes much harder for counterfeiters to pass off their fake products as the real thing. It's about protecting patients and ensuring they have access to safe, authentic devices.
Now, implementing this UDI system is a shared responsibility, right? It's not just on the manufacturers.
You're absolutely right. The MDR lays out specific responsibilities for various actors in the supply chain.
So who's involved and what are they expected to do?
Manufacturers, for starters, are responsible for assigning the UDIs to their devices and submitting the relevant information to the UDI distributors, and importers have to verify the UDI information before they sell a device, making sure it's correctly displayed on the device and packaging, and that the information in UDI is up to date.
It's a team effort ensuring that the UDI system is used consistently and effectively throughout the entire supply chain.
Exactly. And the MDR also encourages healthcare professionals to utilize the UDI system in their daily practice.
How would that work?
For instance, hospitals and clinics can use the UDI to track the devices they're using in patient care. This can help them manage their inventory more efficiently, ensure they're always using the latest versions of devices, and even track which devices were used on a particular patient, which can be incredibly helpful in case of any complications.
It's about using technology to improve patient safety and make healthcare processes more efficient.
Exactly. Implementing the UDI system is undoubtedly a complex undertaking, but it's a critical step towards a more transparent and accountable medical device landscape. It's about making devices safer, making recalls more effective, and making market surveillance more robust. Ultimately, it's about safeguarding patients and giving them confidence that they're receiving high-quality, authentic medical devices.
Now, we've talked a lot about UDEM, this massive database that sits at the heart of the MDR. It sounds incredibly important, almost like a command center for medical device information in the EU. Do you tell us a bit more about what makes it so crucial and how it actually works?
UDEMET is indeed the backbone of the MDR. It's a vast, centralized database that contains a wealth of information about medical devices available in the EU. Think of it as a one-stop shop for everything related to medical devices under the MDR.
We've already touched on some of its functions, like housing the UDI database, but it sounds like it does much more than that.
You're absolutely right. UDEMD is a multifaceted system. One of its core functions, as we've discussed, is to house the UDI database, allowing for the identification and tracking of individual devices. But it also serves as a platform for manufacturers to register themselves and their devices, providing a centralized source of information about who's making what and where those devices are being sold.
It's like a digital directory of medical devices and their manufacturers. If I wanted to find out more about a specific type of medical device, like a particular brand of pacemaker, I could potentially look it up in UDEMD and see who manufactures it, where it's sold, and things like that.
That's the idea. It's all about increasing transparency and making information more readily available to everyone involved, including patients. But Univand goes beyond just being a directory. It also plays a vital role in managing vigilance and post-market surveillance data. Remember how we were talking about how manufacturers have to report any adverse events or safety concerns related to their devices? Well, those reports go into UDAND.
So it's a central repository for all this safety information, allowing authorities to get a real-time overview of how devices are performing in the real world and whether any patterns or concerning trends are emerging.
Precisely, this allows them to take swift action if necessary to protect public health. UDemand also supports the work of notified bodies, providing them with a platform to access information about devices and manufacturers, helping them to carry out their conformity assessments more effectively. It's all about fostering collaboration and information sharing between the different players involved in medical device regulation.
It sounds like Udemod is really revolutionizing how medical devices are regulated in the EU. It's a powerful tool for improving transparency, accountability, and collaboration in the industry.
It absolutely is, and the MDR is very clear that much of the information in Udavon should be accessible to the public. Of course, there are some limitations, especially when it comes to commercially sensitive data, but the goal is to make information about device safety performance and clinical evidence readily available to everyone.
That's a huge win for transparency. It empowers patients and healthcare professionals to make informed decisions and to hold manufacturers accountable for the safety and effectiveness of their devices.
You got it. The MBR sets clear deadlines for the full implementation of Udamod, recognizing that it's a complex and ambitious project. But the ultimate goal is to have a fully functional and interoperable system that supports all aspects of the MDR, from device registration to post-market surveillance. Udamod is set to be an invaluable resource for everyone involved in the medical device landscape: patients, healthcare professionals, manufacturers, and regulators alike.
Now, I want to circle back to those notified bodies, the independent organizations that play such a crucial role in assessing medical devices before they can be sold in the EU. We've already talked about how the MDR raises the bar for them in terms of independence, competence, and transparency. But I'm curious, what happens if a notified body uncovers a problem with a device during their assessment? What kind of authority do they have to address it?
They have quite a bit of authority, actually. If a notified body identifies an issue during their conformity assessment, they can take several steps. They can ask the manufacturer to provide more information, conduct additional tests, or even require the manufacturer to make changes to the device or its documentation before they'll issue a CE certificate, which is the stamp of approval that allows the device to be sold in the EU.
So they have the power to stop a device from reaching the market if they believe it doesn't meet the MDR's requirements.
Exactly. They're the gatekeepers, essentially making sure that only devices that have been thoroughly vetted and deemed safe and effective can be sold in the EU.
That's reassuring to know. But even after a device is on the market, there's still that ongoing monitoring through the vigilance system and market surveillance, right?
Absolutely. The MDR puts a lot of emphasis on post-market surveillance, recognizing that even with the most rigorous pre-market assessments, problems can still emerge once a device is being used in the real world.
It's like a safety net, ensuring that any issues that arise are identified and addressed quickly.
Now, I want to touch on a concept that's particularly relevant in the context of the MDR, the idea of intended purpose.
Okay, intended purpose, that sounds important. What exactly does it mean in the world of medical devices?
Essentially, the intended purpose of a medical device is the specific use for which the manufacturer designed and intends the device to be used. It's a crucial concept because it determines a lot about how the device is regulated, tested, and even marketed.
So a device intended to be used for in diagnosing a specific disease would be regulated differently than a device intended to treat that same disease, even if they're both targeting the same condition.
Exactly. The intended purpose dictates a lot about how the device is classified in terms of risk, what kind of clinical data needs to be gathered to support its safety and effectiveness, and what kind of claims the manufacturer can make about the device.
So manufacturers can't just decide to market a device for whatever they want. They have to stick to the intended purpose they established during the design and development process.
Precisely, and the MDR is very clear that the intended purpose needs to be stated in the device's documentation and labeling so that healthcare professionals and patients are aware of what the device is meant to be used for.
It's all about transparency and ensuring that devices are used appropriately.
Exactly. The MDR also recognizes that sometimes the way a device is actually used in the real world might deviate from its intended purpose.
That makes sense. Healthcare professionals might find innovative ways to use a device that the manufacturer didn't originally anticipate, or patients might try to use a device for something it wasn't designed for.
Exactly. And while the MDR doesn't explicitly regulate what healthcare professionals can do with a device once it's in their hands, it does emphasize the importance of using devices responsibly and within their intended scope of use.
It's about balancing innovation and flexibility with safety and ensuring that devices are used in a way that minimizes risks to patients.
Now let's talk about another important aspect of the MDR, its focus on clinical evaluation.
Clinical evaluation, that sounds familiar. We've touched on it a bit when we talked about clinical investigations, but it seems like a broader concept than just conducting studies.
You're absolutely right. Clinical evaluation is a core element of the MDR, and it's all about ensuring that medical devices are supported by solid clinical evidence throughout their entire life cycle. It's not a one-time thing, it's an ongoing process.
So it's not just about proving a device is safe and effective before it hits the market. It's about continually gathering and assessing data to make sure that the device continues to meet those standards as it's being used in the real world.
Exactly. The MDR outlines a very structured approach to clinical evaluation, emphasizing a life cycle approach where manufacturers are constantly gathering and analyzing data from pre-market clinical investigations to post-market surveillance.
So it's like a continuous feedback loop where real-world data is used to inform decisions about a device's safety and effectiveness. What are some of the key elements of this clinical evaluation process?
Well, one of the first steps is for manufacturers to develop a clinical evaluation plan.
Okay.
This plan outlines their strategy for gathering and assessing clinical data. It identifies all the relevant data sources, outlines the methods for data analysis, and specifies how the clinical evidence will be used to support the device's safety and performance claims. It's like a roadmap for the entire clinical evaluation process.
So it's not just about collecting data randomly, it's about having a clear plan in place from the start.
Exactly, and an MDR also provides guidance on what types of clinical data can be used to support a device's clinical evaluation. This can include data from specifically designed clinical investigations, as well as data from other sources such as published literature, patient registries, and post-market surveillance data.
So it's a multifaceted approach using a variety of data sources to get a comprehensive picture of a device's safety and effectiveness.
Precisely, and the MDR recognizes that in some cases, conducting a full-blown clinical investigation might not be necessary or even ethical.
I could see how that would be the case. If you have a device that's very similar to an existing device with a long track record of safety and effectiveness, it might not be necessary to put patients through a whole new clinical trial.
Exactly, but even in those cases where a new clinical investigation isn't necessary, the MDR requires manufacturers to provide a very clear justification for why they believe the existing data is sufficient. They have to show that the data is relevant, reliable, and can be extrapolated to the new device.
So they can't just take shortcuts. They have to make a strong case for why they're not doing a new clinical investigation.
Now, when clinical investigations are conducted, the NDR outlines specific requirements that manufacturers need to follow.
We've touched on this a bit earlier, but it's worth emphasizing how important those ethical considerations are, especially when it comes to informed consent and protecting vulnerable populations.
You're absolutely right. The MDR makes it very clear that patient safety and well-being are paramount in any clinical investigation.
And the MDR also introduces that concept of a consultation procedure for certain types of high-risk devices where manufacturers can get feedback from an expert panel on their clinical evaluation plan and propose clinical investigations before they go through the formal assessment process.
Yes, that's a great way for manufacturers to get expert input early on and make sure they're on the right track.
It's like having a dress rehearsal before the big performance.
Now, even after a device is on the market and being used by patients, the clinical evaluation process doesn't end. The MDR stresses the importance of post-market clinical follow-up.
Because real-world use often reveals things that weren't apparent in those initial clinical investigations.
Exactly. Manufacturers need to continue collecting and assessing clinical data after their devices are out in the world. This data can be used to confirm the initial findings about the device's safety and effectiveness, identify any emerging risks, and inform any updates that might be needed to the device or its clinical evaluation.
It's like a continuous quality improvement process.
Exactly. The MDR requires manufacturers to have a post-market clinical follow-up plan that outlines their strategy for monitoring the device's performance and safety. This plan needs to specify what data sources they'll use, how they'll analyze the data, and how they'll respond if they identify any safety concerns. It's a crucial part of the MDR's overall approach to patient safety.
It's reassuring to know that the MDR takes this life cycle approach to clinical evaluation. It's not just about getting a device approved, it's about ensuring that the device remains safe and effective throughout its entire lifespan. Now let's shift gears for a moment and talk about how the MDR handles complaints about medical devices.
That's a good point to bring up. Complaints can be a valuable source of information about potential problems with a device.
I imagine manufacturers are required to have a system in place for handling complaints.
You're absolutely right. The NDR requires manufacturers to establish and maintain a system for recording and investigating complaints about their devices.
So if a healthcare professional or a patient has a problem with a device, They need a clear way to report that issue to the manufacturer.
Exactly. The complaint handling system needs to be accessible, easy to use, and well documented. The MDR also outlines specific information that needs to be included in a complaint, like the device's identification details about the incident and any relevant patient information.
So it's not just a casual, hey, I didn't like this device. There's a specific format and information that needs to be provided to help the manufacturer investigate the issue properly.
Precisely, and manufacturers can't just receive these complaints and file them away. They have to actively investigate them.
What kind of investigation are we talking about?
The MDR requires manufacturers to determine the nature and cause of the complaint, evaluate whether the complaint suggests a serious incident that needs to be reported to the competent authorities, and take appropriate corrective actions if necessary. This might involve making changes to the device's design, its manufacturing process, or its labeling. It could even lead to a recall of the device if a serious safety issue is identified. It's all about taking complaints seriously and using them as opportunities to improve device safety and quality.
So those complaint forms we sometimes see in hospitals or doctors' offices, those aren't just for show. They're actually an important part of the MDR system for monitoring device safety.
Exactly. They provide a mechanism for healthcare professionals and patients to raise concerns and for manufacturers to receive valuable feedback about their devices.
Now I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the concept of intended purpose when it comes to medical devices. Can you explain a bit more about why that's so important under the MDR?
Certainly, the intended purpose of a medical device is essentially the specific use for which the manufacturer designed and intends the device to be used. It's a fundamental concept in the MDL because it influences many aspects of how the device is regulated, tested, and even marketed.
So it's not just a technicality, it's a core element of the MDR's framework.
Exactly. The intended purpose determines a lot about how the device is classified in terms of risk, what kind of clinical data needs to be gathered to support its safety and effectiveness, and what kind of claims the manufacturer can make about the device.
So if a manufacturer develops a device intended to be used for diagnosing a specific disease, they can't just turn around and start marketing it for treating that same disease without going through the appropriate regulatory processes to demonstrate that it's safe and effective for that new intended purpose.
Absolutely. They have to stick to the intended purpose they established during the design and development process and have to back up any claims they make about the device with solid evidence. The intended purpose also needs to be stated clearly in the device's documentation and labeling so that healthcare professionals and patients are aware of what the device is meant to be used for and can use it appropriately.
It's all about transparency and making sure that everyone understands what a device is designed to do and how it should be used. But I imagine there are situations where the way a device is actually used in the real world might differ from its intended purpose.
You're absolutely right. Sometimes healthcare professionals might find innovative ways to use a device that the manufacturer didn't originally anticipate, or patients might try to use a device for something it wasn't designed for. The MDR doesn't explicitly regulate what healthcare professionals can do with the device once it's in their hands, but it does emphasize the importance of using devices responsibly and within their intended scope of use. It's about striking a balance between encouraging innovation and flexibility while ensuring patient safety.
Now, we've talked a lot about the MDR's impact on manufacturers, notified bodies, and competent authorities, but at the end of the day, the MDR is really all about protecting patients. What does this mean for the average person in the EU who uses medical devices?
That's a great question. The MDR has several implications for patients. First and foremost, it means that the medical devices, they use everything from a simple bandage to a complex implant, have gone through a much more rigorous approval process to ensure their safety and effectiveness.
So patients can have more confidence that the devices they're using have been thoroughly vetted and meet high standards.
Exactly. The MDR also emphasizes the importance of patient information, and empowerment patients have the right to access clear and understandable information about the devices they use, including any potential risks and benefits.
So no more being in the dark about what's going into your body or how a device works. You have the right to ask questions and get clear answers from your healthcare providers.
Precisely. The MDR also encourages patients to report any adverse events or problems they experience with the device. This information is crucial for monitoring device safety and identifying any emerging issues.
So patients have a role to play in ensuring that devices remain safe and effective.
Exactly. The MDR is all about creating a system where everyone involved, manufacturers, regulators, healthcare professionals, and patients, works together to improve device safety and protect public health.
And for those who are really interested in learning more about the MDR and how it impacts them, all the documentation, including the regulations themselves, guidance documents, and information about specific devices and manufacturers, is publicly available.
That's right, knowledge is power, and the more you understand about medical devices and how they're regulated, the better equipped you are to make informed decisions about your healthcare.
So this deep dive has been a fascinating journey through the complex world of the EU medical device regulation. We've explored its wide-ranging scope, its emphasis on risk management and clinical evidence, its stringent requirements for manufacturers and notified bodies, and its focus on patient safety and transparency.
It's a complex and demanding regulation, but it's a testament to the EU's commitment to protecting the health and well-being of its citizens. The MDR is a game changer for the medical device industry, and it's setting a new global standard for medical device regulation.
So the next time you use a medical device, remember the MDR and all the work that goes on behind the scenes to ensure that device is safe and effective.
And as always, stay curious, keep asking questions, and be an advocate for your own health.